Praise the Lord. Today's Bible reading portion is taken from 1 Kings chapter 20 to 22. In chapter 20, Ahab rejects the requests of the king of Syria. Ben-Hadad of Syria and a confederation of 32 kings attacked Samaria. They had sent messengers to Ahab claiming all of his possession as his own. Later, Ben-Hadad told Ahab he was sending men into Samaria to spoil the city and take anything that they wanted. Ahab protested and refused to let Ben-Hadad proceed. Chapter 13 to 22. God promised to give Ahab victory even though his army was significantly small. Ahab instigated the battle when Ben-Hadad and his allies were drinking. They defeated the men, but the king escaped on a horse. Israel struck the horses and chariots and struck the Assyrians with a great blow. A prophet of God also warned Ahab the Syrians would return in the springtime. Verses 23 to 34. Ben-Hadad's advisor counseled him that a loss was due to the Israelites, where God was being a God of the hills. They advised him to rebuild his army and fight in the plain next time. The Syrians filled the country, but the Israelites were like two little flocks of goats. Israel killed 1,00,000 Syrians and 27 more were killed when the walls of Aphek fell on them. After the battle, Ahab let Ben-Hadad live there. He also made a covenant with him and sent him home. Verses 35 to 43. A prophet told a man to strike him because the Lord commanded it. When the man refused, the prophet told him he would be killed by a lion for disobeying God. The prophet found another man and repeated the instruction. This time the man struck him and injured him. When the king arrived, the prophet pretended he was a man who had been entrusted with another man at the risk of his life, but he had failed this job. He told Ahab the man he was supposed to be guarding had escaped. He also told him he deserved to die for failing at his job. But then the prophet took off his bandage and announced a condemnation on the king. God had entrusted Ahab with destroying Ben-Hadad, but Ahab had failed and let him go. God was going to require Ahab's life as a punishment. Moving on from that, chapter 21 talks about the tragedy of Naboth's vineyard. Now, a man named Naboth lived in Jezreel and owned a vineyard near Ahab's place. This place was also the palace. Ahab wanted the vineyard to use as a green garden, so he offered to give Naboth a better vineyard or to pay him for the property. Naboth didn't want to sell because the land belonged to his family by inheritance. Ahab angrily returned to his house and Jezebel told what happened. She reassured her husband she would get Naboth's vineyard for him. She wrote letters to the rulers of Jezreel and had them hire 2 false witnesses who were worthless men who accused Naboth of cursing God and the king. The men of the city took Naboth and stoned him. Jezebel gleefully went to her husband and reported Naboth's death. Shortly thereafter, Ahab went to Jezreel to take possession of the vineyard. Chapter 21 verses 17 to 29. God told Elijah to meet Ahab at Naboth's vineyard. He was to tell Ahab that God had seen his sin and he would escape the judgment, but he will not be spared. Elijah cursed Ahab and told him God would destroy his house like the houses of Jeroboam and Baasha. Anyone who belonged to Ahab who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone of his who dies in the open country, the birds of the heavens shall eat. Jezebel was also cursed. Elijah said she would be eaten by dogs in Jezreel. After hearing this condemnation, Ahab tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and humbled himself. God took notice of this humility, and although he didn't withdraw the curse, he delayed punishing the house of Ahab until his death. Chapter 22 outlines Micaiah, who prophesied Ahab's death in the mad battle. Now, after a period of peace between Syria and Israel, as we could see in chapter 20, Jehoshaphat asked Ahab to drive the Syrians out of Ramoth Gilead, a city that previously belonged to Israel. Jehoshaphat agreed to help Ahab, but he determined to ask for God's approval before acting. The kings gathered 400 prophets, and they all affirmed that the Lord will bless the battle. But Jehoshaphat was not convinced. He asked Ahab if there were any other prophets. He told him that there was one another who is Micaiah, but Ahab hated him because Micaiah never said anything good about him. Micaiah was also summoned, and he told Ahab about a vision God had revealed to him. In the vision, God was on his throne asking his heavenly servants which one of them would entice Ahab to go to battle at Ramoth Gilead. One spirit went to God and accepted the job. When God asked the spirit how he proposed to entice Ahab, he responded that it would put a lying spirit in the mouths of the prophets who advised Ahab. God accepted the spirit's proposal and sent him to complete the work. God was going to allow the 400 prophets to encourage Ahab to go to war because God intended to destroy Ahab for his wickedness. In chapter 22, verses continuing from 29 to 40, Ahab is killed while battling with the Syrians. Jehoshaphat and Ahab went to Ramoth Gilead to fight the Syrians. He disguised himself probably because he feared his fate would be as Micaiah prophesied. The Syrian commanders were specifically instructed to hunt him, but they couldn't find him in his disguise. But an archer drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. The battle lasted all day, and Ahab was propped up in his chariot until he eventually died, and the army of Israel scattered thereafter. Ahab's blood was washed out of the chariot at the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked it up just as Elijah had prophesied. Jehoshaphat reigned over Judah for 25 years. For the most part, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Later, Ahab's son Ahaziah took the throne after his father's death, where he reigned for 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just like his father. This sums up the chapters for today. I hope it was useful. Thank you all for listening, and God bless.